that wants attention around this place. You start getting too much attention around here. You know what happens. You ready? You ready? The Subcommittee on Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. As a reminder, if members insert a document into the record, please also email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. I now recognize myself for the purpose of an opening statement for 5 minutes. I'd like to welcome our witnesses this morning hearing on fiscal year 2027 Coast Guard Budget General Request. Admiral Lundy, Commandant of the Coast Guard, and Master Chief Philip Waldron, Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard, we are glad to have both of you here today. Thank you very much, and all the other members that are here with us. This budget request arrives at a momentous inflection point for the Coast Guard. The service has never been better positioned to grow, and it has rarely been busier, more effective, or more in demand. Even amid uncertainty regarding pay, Coast Guard capabilities, commitment, and professionalism have never been more evident. The President's request of nearly $16 billion for the Coast Guard in fiscal year 2027 reflects strong support for the service. The $2 billion increase in operations funding would help deliver meaningful results in protecting our maritime domain, enforcing U.S. laws, and safeguarding our resources. However, it still falls short of what is needed to fully operate and sustain the assets which will be acquired through the historic $25 billion investment that Congress provided in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. The reconciliation investment was intended to reverse decades of underinvestment at the requested levels. The Coast Guard risks acquiring assets without home ports, infrastructure, and support systems required to operate them effectively. The Coast Guard enjoys strong bipartisan goodwill in Congress. Compliance with mandated oversight, however, is not among them. Congress has a responsibility to ensure the appropriated funds are used properly and effectively. When the Coast Guard fails to meet statutory oversight requirements, it undermines its credibility with those most committed to supporting it. Congress has mandated basic acquisition planning tools, including regularly quarterly briefings and a 5-year capital investment plans to ensure visibility into the long-term needs. Yet the Coast Guard has consistently failed to meet these statutory requirements. This raises a fundamental concern. If the Coast Guard cannot meet its oversight obligations, can it effectively manage large, complex, and costly acquisition programs? The service now stands at a very decisive moment. That is, in many respects, an either-or proposition. Either the Coast Guard successfully manages the acquisition and integration of the new assets while growing the organization, or the historic investment provided by Congress will fail to produce the modern, capable service the investment envisioned. The central question is whether the Coast Guard can successfully manage the acquisition, integration, and expansion of these assets, along with the infrastructure and personnel required to sustain them. Growth is not simply a matter of adding ships, aircraft, facilities, and personnel. It requires a clear and disciplined understanding of how to sustain a larger and more complex organization. Elements of this budget request raise concerns about whether that balance has been achieved. The addition of assets and personnel must occur in tandem with the planning and funding of the foundational support they require. Admiral, you hold one of the most consequential roles in government today. On the one hand, you have the opportunity to be the commandant who leads the Coast Guard through an historic transformation. With the right vision, planning, and transparency, you can help shape a service that is modern, strategically aligned, and properly resourced for the missions ahead. That would be a lasting legacy. On the other hand, you risk being held accountable if the service fails to capitalize on this moment and continues to struggle with execution and credibility. This is a defining institutional crossroads. I am very confident that you have the leadership qualities necessary to succeed, but success will require partnership with Congress. Every member of this subcommittee stands ready to support the Coast Guard's evolution. That support, however, depends on the service meeting its legal obligation to provide timely, complete, and transparent information. Goodwill and patience are not unlimited. I urge you to accept the partnership this committee offers and to commit to providing the information necessary to ensure that the Coast Guard becomes the service it can be and should be. Admiral Lundy and Master Chief Waldron, thank you for being here today, and I look forward to this discussion. I now recognize Ranking Member Carbajal for an opening statement of 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Ezell. I will yield to Ranking Member Larson.
Thank you, Chair Ezell.
Recognized.
Thank you, Chair Ezell and Ranking Member Carbajal. Thanks for calling this hearing today and giving us a chance to review the Coast Guard's FY27 budget request. I want to welcome and thank Admiral Lundy and Master Chief Waldron as well for being here today and for the meeting yesterday. Unfortunately, we're meeting today amid yet another lapse of appropriations affecting the Coast Guard. We could pay coasties and provide immediate certainty and stability if we were allowed to vote on the funding bill that already passed the Senate unanimously. Most importantly, though, I want the women and men of the Coast Guard to know they deserve better from their government. For many years, the Coast Guard and senior leaders of the service have called for increased funding so the Coast Guard can perform as the $20 billion agency that it should be. Congress and the administration cannot keep asking more from this service without making these investments. Every day, the women and men of the Coast Guard go out on their missions to save lives, protect our maritime borders, and to keep commerce flowing. The administration's FY27 budget request offers significant promise in some areas, particularly in the operations and support or ONS budget, which increases by 20%. Funding in this range will continue efforts to better prepare the Coast Guard for its core missions and increase the number of service members. This will be necessary as the Coast Guard reconstitutes the stations it downsized during COVID-era recruitment gaps. More funding for the Coast Guard means more lives saved, safer maritime commerce, and more interdicted drugs. Despite the misguided lethal actions taken by the Department of Defense, this Coast Guard yet remains the most effective tool to combat illicit maritime activity. That said, the administration's procurements, construction, and investments, or PC&I budget request fails to meet the needs of the current Coast Guard, let alone one with a growth goal of 15,000 personnel. So I'm eager to discuss the discrepancy between the two major funding pillars and how Congress can fill the gap. The Coast Guard received historic funding last year from the reconciliation bill. Much of that funding was needed to recapitalize assets well past their service life and push the service into the future with the acquisition of state-of-the-art systems. However, this funding and the increase to ONS will be meaningless if we're unable to support the new personnel and assets with adequate home porting piers, workstations, housing, childcare, and healthcare facilities. Supporting the Coast Guard must start with supporting the women and men who serve. This is one of my primary issues with the administration's request. A 15% decrease in the PC&I and funding simply does not do the job. For example, $306 million of the $346 million dedicated to shoreside infrastructure is slated to be spent in Alaska for Arctic security cutter home porting. That leaves $40 million left to attempt to address an over $7 billion backlog. So I wholeheartedly support the funding and forward thinking of the service to tackle these projects because they're needed. However, existing sites like Base Seattle, Training Center Cape May, and the Academy have infrastructure demands that we should address now and prioritize funding there. So I look forward to hearing from both of you today how the Coast Guard views the prioritization of these projects. Furthermore, as the Coast Guard begins to acquire and reinvest in new or previously downgraded and shuttered shoreside facilities, it must prioritize sites that enables it to broaden the coverage of its search and rescue functions. Reconstituting these stations will be a vital benefit as the Coast Guard grows its personnel. Finally, I want to draw attention to the recent changes to the planned home porting of assets at Coast Guard-based Seattle, raised in a news article in an April 11th story and recently confirmed by Coast Guard documents. Initial project plans include upgrades to Seattle waterfront to home port 4 offshore patrol cutters, but have now been scaled back to accommodating, quote, up to 4 major cutters instead. So I do want to hear more details from the Coast Guard about this change and how the Coast Guard plans to prioritize the planning and funding associated with base Seattle home porting. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Coast Guard's ongoing effort to address sexual assault and sexual harassment in the service. The Accountability and Transparency Review initiated by the former commandant steered the Coast Guard in the right direction, and I'm pleased that you are building on that momentum. The committee will continue to conduct vigorous oversight of the service's actions to implement the AT&R, and we stand ready to help. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Sam Graves, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thanks to you, Chairman Ezell, and I also want to thank our witnesses for being here today and congratulate Admiral Langley on your confirmation to, or Lundy, sorry, on your confirmation to the Coast Guard as Commandant. So that's fantastic. The committee stands ready to partner with you to ensure that the service has the resources needed to carry out our mission and protect our nation. I look forward to hearing what the witnesses have to say today about the administration's fiscal year 2027 budget request for the Coast Guard. Admiral Lundy, before turning to the topic of the hearing, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the 50,000 men and women serving both military and civilian roles who are continuing to carry out the critical Coast Guard mission despite the uncertainty over their next paycheck. We owe it to our coasties who continue to stand watch. We owe it to them to secure a deal to fund DHS, which the T&I committee is committed to doing. Over the last year, I've been extremely proud of the historic investment that this committee has made to rebuild our nation's Coast Guard. After years of inadequate funding, the $25 billion provided in the reconciliation funding package is going to enable the service to build its fleet of surface, air, and shoreside assets. Case in point, your new C-130s that will be operating at Barbers Point, Hawaii, require larger hangars to ensure that those assets are adequately maintained. I've seen firsthand the inadequate storage space for these planes, and I appreciate your continued effort to upgrade the facilities for all of these assets. And I want to emphasize that with the historic investments this committee has provided comes a responsibility to ensure that the money is spent wisely, and I would ask that the Coast Guard remain committed to the production of acquisition briefings and long-term planning documents that the committee requires in order to conduct oversight. Admiral Lundy, Master Chief Waldron, thank you again for being here, and I look forward to your testimony, and I really appreciate what you all are doing in some very, very trying times. So thank you for your work, and thanks for being here. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes Mr. Carbajal for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Ezell, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Welcome, Admiral Lundy and Master Chief Waldron. Unfortunately, we're holding today's hearing while the men and women serving in the Coast Guard are facing financial uncertainty. While I know that my Republican colleagues and I disagree about the direction of ICE and CBP, I hope we agree about the value of the Coast Guard. I urge my colleagues to support the bipartisan funding bill passed unanimously by the Senate that would provide financial certainty to the Coast Guard service members. Last year, when we held this hearing, the Coast Guard was in the middle of great change across the board. The service was about to receive historic funding and reconciliation, and Coast Guard leaders were championing service-wide changes that were included in Force Design 28, even though that plan was and still is a relative mystery. I may not have agreed with the former secretary much, but she was right when she said that the Coast Guard has been neglected and under-resourced for far too long. Unfortunately, here we are a year later, and when I look at the budget, I remain just as concerned. Overall, Coast Guard funding in the budget request increased by 15%, which is great news. With the increasing demands being placed on the Coast Guard, it is appropriate that the budget allows for significant growth among service members. This funding increase is truly overdue and more than deserved. More Coast Guard is something everyone on this committee supports. Unfortunately, the budget takes a big step backward on recapitalizing the Coast Guard shoreside infrastructure, reducing the PC&I funding by 15%. Reconciliation funding becomes meaningless if it is not met with strong regular appropriations. The Government Accountability Office issued a report last year that found the Coast Guard's $7 billion estimate for the shoreside infrastructure backlog is actually much higher, due to over 200 projects lacking cost estimates. A reduction at this stage is completely irresponsible and unacceptable. Budgets show priorities. This president's budget is a reflection of his values. At some point, we must get past the awe of reconciliation and recognize that just like a ship takes years to build and requires regular maintenance, so do buildings, so do piers, so do homes, so do childcare facilities. This is a people issue. I've met a lot of service members and can say without hesitation they deserve better. I am hopeful that with some of the recent programmatic and procurement changes, we will be able to see effective management and better contracting decisions. I look forward to hearing about these changes and improvements in today's hearing. If the Coast Guard expects to grow the service by 15,000 members, it must continue to advocate for consistency in funding and must focus on managing this recapitalization effort judiciously. Congress has the opportunity to right this ship, and I look forward to talking to our witnesses about the needs of our future Coast Guard. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Admiral Lundy for his 5 minutes opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Graves, Chairman Ezell, Ranking Member Larson, Ranking Member Carbajal, and distinguished members of this committee, thank you for the opportunity for both of us to testify today on behalf of the dedicated men and women of the United States Coast Guard. Mr. Chairman, I ask that my written testimony be entered into the record.
Without objection.
The Coast Guard is a vital instrument of national power that provides unprecedented value to the American people. We save lives. We control, secure, and defend the U.S. border and maritime approaches. We facilitate commerce that's vital to U.S. economic prosperity, and we respond to crises or contingencies that come without warning. The American people depend on us, and we provide them a remarkable return on that investment. And we need that investment right now. Now, this hearing is about the fiscal year 27 budget, but as you've already discussed in your opening statements, the reality today is the Coast Guard is operating in a crisis. Day 74 of a DHS lapse in appropriations. This is needlessly harming our people and hollowing out our readiness. Over 6,000 Coast Guard units and homes are at risk of shutoff of electricity, water, and other utilities. And we've already suffered some shutoffs in the last week. Each day, we're begging frustrated service providers to keep that power and water going, and we're destroying the trust of the local businesses, many of them small businesses, that are providing those critical services. We have a massive growing backlog, over 18,000 U.S. merchant mariner credentials that are slowing progress at a time where the nation is trying to rebuild our maritime might. And it's also paralyzed our process to suspend or revoke the mariner credentials of U.S. mariners who engage in sexual assault. My greatest concern is the toll this is taking on our people and their families, the severe hardship and uncertainty, not knowing whether they'll be paid after this week. Because of this lapse, thousands of military personnel are starting their summer transfers, but they can't get their advanced allowances, meaning they have to put significant debt on credit cards, deplete personal savings, or take out loans they can't afford. They're delaying major family expenses because of the uncertainty about pay. Some even deferring on medical treatments, not sure whether they can manage the copay for insurance. For our civilians, the financial hardship of their going without 2 months of no pay has left them feeling betrayed. We thank the President for his bold, decisive action several weeks ago to ensure all of our people were paid despite the lapse, and the Secretary's leadership and tenacity to fight for DHS funding. This committee knows us, knows the Coast Guard. You have always supported the Coast Guard and our people, and we ask for your continued strongest advocacy across Capitol Hill now for Congress to fund DHS and the Coast Guard, end this lapse, and pay our people, and to never let this happen again. Now on to 2027. With a strong support from this Congress and a $25 billion capital investment last year in new cutters, aircraft, shore facilities, and technology, the Coast Guard is undergoing a historic modernization. But buying new assets to recapitalize the fleet is only a down payment. As I've testified before, we're a $20 billion Coast Guard that's not funded at that level. We need higher top-line growth and annual appropriations to conduct missions that meet the needs of the American people. The President's fiscal year 27 budget request significantly advances the service in that direction, focused on three priorities. First, rebuilding readiness through our people. Our service readiness starts with the readiness of every Coast Guard man and woman and their families. They're our greatest treasure, and we must provide them with quality housing, childcare, and support systems they need. The 27 budget prioritizes them by funding a military pay raise with a targeted increase for junior personnel, providing them child care subsidies on par with the other military services, and expanding Coast Guard medical and training support to give them what they need. Second, growing the workforce. To meet escalating global demands, the Coast Guard needs to grow by 15,000. In 2025, we achieved record recruiting results, the greatest since 1991. This budget request builds on that success, requesting 5,768 new positions to expand recruiting capacity, stand up new operating forces, and crew our new assets. And finally, expanding our capabilities and infrastructure. This budget initiates the third stage of the offshore patrol cutter acquisition, the backbone of our fleet. It also funds required shore infrastructure for new assets, including the first two Arctic security cutters, which will be home ported in the state of Alaska. By ending the current lapse in appropriations and supporting the President's fiscal year 27 budget request, you will secure Coast Guard mission success well into the future. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Admiral. Master Chief, would you like to make an opening statement?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Chairman Graves, Chairman Ezell, Ranking Member Larson, Ranking Member Carbajal, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you all for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the dedicated men of the United States Coast Guard. My name is Phil Waldron. I'm a second-generation Coast Guardsman, and to me, the Coast Guard is a family business. This is the only job that I ever wanted to do, and I'm proud to serve not only as the 15th Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard, but I'm humbled to every day get to put on the same uniform as the men and women who I personally consider heroes. Today's hearing is focused on the fiscal year 2027 budget request, but my most sacred duty is to our workforce, and I owe it to them to speak plainly about their reality from the deck plates. Our total workforce has spent a majority of this fiscal year operating under uncertainty, fear, and anger caused by a lapse in appropriations. The dangerous missions that our folks conduct every day, from hoisting survivors from freezing water to stopping smuggling vessels at night, requires their complete and total focus. That focus is dangerously fractured when they're worried about paying their rent or supporting their families. You are this service's greatest advocates, and I cannot stress enough the urgency for Congress to end this lapse and fully fund the U.S. Coast Guard. Every day, Coast Guard men and women put their lives on the line to protect, defend, and save. That work is performed by our total workforce, our active duty and reserve members, our dedicated civilian employees, our auxiliary, and our families who provide the vital support that our people rely on. Looking to the future, the Coast Guard is underway with our most substantial transformation since World War II. We're acquiring new assets and expanding our missions, but we're not forgetting our roots, and we know that new steel means nothing without supported, highly trained crews. The fiscal year 2027 budget request is fundamentally an investment in those crews. It targets three critical areas for our workforce. First, individual and family readiness. Our service members and their families are integral parts of the communities where they serve. This budget requests $53 million to expand medical care and personnel support at our bases and air stations. Crucially, it also requests $39 million to staff 2 new child development centers and finally bring our workforce closer to the child care parity they deserve alongside their Department of War counterparts. Second, sustaining our recruiting momentum. In 2025, we saw our greatest recruiting successes in decades. To keep that momentum and grow our force, this budget invests $63 million to add more than 300 positions to our talent acquisition workforce and open new recruiting offices across the country. Third, modernizing our training pipeline. When we bring in thousands of new recruits, we must get them trained and out to the fleet efficiently. This budget requests $73 million to increase capacity across our training system. This will alleviate the immense strain on our training centers, which are currently operating above maximum capacity, and get our most junior members into their technical schools at a much faster pace. To keep pace with the growing demands placed on the Coast Guard, we need your support for timely, stable, consistent annual top-line growth. Funding the Coast Guard below this request jeopardizes the long-term readiness of the service, putting American lives, national security, and economic prosperity at risk. I'm humbled to have the privilege to serve with and represent our total workforce, and by enacting an appropriation for fiscal year 2026 and supporting the fiscal year 2027 budget, now is the time to move the U.S. Coast Guard forward. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Gentleman yields. Briefly, I'll take a moment to explain the lighting system to our witnesses. There are 3 lights in front of you. Green means go, yellow means you're running out of time, and red means put on brakes. I ask unanimous consent that the witnesses' full statements be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses has provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 additional days for additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. As your written testimony has been made part of the record, the committee asks that you limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Admiral Lundy, thank you again for being here today. Last year's reconciliation package provided the Coast Guard with a historic investment of nearly $25 billion to procure an estimated 17 new icebreakers, 21 new cutters, over 40 helicopters, 6 C-130J aircraft, while modernizing shore infrastructure and maritime surveillance systems. For these assets to serve our vital national security missions and ensure safe commerce, the Coast Guard will need more infrastructure, housing, training, and people. Can you explain how your fiscal 2027 budget supports these goals?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. One of the things that I'm most proud about the President's strong support is it continues his focus as being an advocate for renewal of our Coast Guard, and along with the strong support of OMB and the Department of Homeland Security. This is reflected in clearly the historic investment that Congress also supported, but also now and will be supported with the President's budget request for 27. It reflects a significant increase in our operating funds to grow the workforce we'll need to crew and support all of the assets that the renewal in the Working Family Tax Code Act is going to bring us. And so the budget requests will bring 5,768 new people. So for example, Mr. Chairman, of the 11 icebreakers, which are our top priority, the Arctic security cutters for the nation, that requires 1,300 Coast Guard men and women just to crew, operate, and maintain those 11 Arctic security cutters. And then we have additional people we need to recruit that workforce and then also to support them and take care of them. And so the budget request that has a significant increase, almost $2 billion in O&S increase over the 25 CR amount, is necessary for us to grow the workforce at the pace we need.
Thank you. Going forward, what's your plan to request the resources that the service requires in order to sustain its operations over the long term and fulfill the President's vision of a recapitalized Coast Guard?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The strength of the President's budget request in 27 reflects our most immediate needs. But beyond the top line, we look forward to providing the committee and Congress with the unfunded priority list that reflects additional needs the service has as we grow toward that $20 billion Coast Guard that the nation and the American people demand we provide the services at.
Air and surface autonomous assets have the ability to serve as a multi-force multiplier to support the service's ability to execute search and rescue missions and confront drug and human traffickers. The reconciliation legislation provided significant support for such systems. Can you speak a little bit how the President's budget continues to support that?
Yes, sir. So the President's budget request includes $69 million for additional long-range unmanned aerial systems. This is on top of the significant investment in the Working Family Tax Cut Act for UAS. The UAS that we operate, and it spans a range from short range, medium range, and long range, and the 27 budget request is for additional long-range UAS. That is proving to be game-changing technology that is enabling our crewed cutters and aircraft to be much more effective, from search and rescue to countering cartels by stopping the flow of illegal and dangerous drugs toward the United States and our communities. What we've proven with our mission success over the last 15 months plus is that when it matters, the Coast Guard delivers. And so the investments in uncrewed systems are vital to our ability to continue to deliver those mission results.
Thank you. And just tell me a little bit how important these systems are for your capability and your growth.
Yes, sir. And so those systems are vital because they enable us as a force multiplier. So one example, Mr. Chairman, the Coast Guard cutter Stone, one of our national security cutters in the fall, was in the Eastern Pacific under Operation Pacific Viper, countering cartels that are moving cocaine at bulk. And we're operating under Maritime Law Enforcement Authority. Using onboard UAS, they were able to prosecute and take down, seize, and detain the individuals aboard 4 separate go-fast vessels loaded with cocaine. Record-breaking, we've never done 4 at once. Until about 3 weeks later when another national security cutter, the James, did exactly the same thing. And so we're breaking our own records with this new unmatched technology that we're bringing to bear.
Thank you, and I yield back my time, and I now recognize Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Chairman Ezell. I will yield to Committee Ranking Member Larson.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member. Master Chief Waldron, thanks for being here today. We talked about recruitment. We talked about recruitment numbers today as well, and we had a chance to talk about that, how the Coast Guard is exceeding last year's recruiting goals. But we haven't talked really about retention, both from the enlisted as well as the officer corps. And while each segment has its differences, there are things that are consistent: healthcare, housing, medical, childcare. So there's been a recent spike in officer retirements. What are you seeing on the enlisted side?
Thank you, sir. On the enlisted side, we're not seeing the spikes that we've seen on the officer corps. In fact, our retention has remained relatively stable as of late. I'd be remiss to not point out that as we continue in a lapse, there's a lot of conversation amongst the crew that they wonder, is this the job that I want to continue doing whenever I'm not certain that I'm going to continue getting paid? But as it stands right now, sir, our retention is relatively stable across the enlisted side.
So that aside, even though it's a reality, set that aside for a moment. What do we need to ensure is happening so you can maintain that consistent retention?
Sir, as the Commandant stated a few minutes ago, whenever he said that the readiness of the service begins with the individual readiness of our members and their families, that's the side that I remain squarely focused on there. And so when we talk about the medical side of the house there, quite frankly, we've struggled with medical care for our folks and their families over time. A lot of that's just simply due to the size of our medical force. For comparison, in the U.S. Navy, the hospital corpsman rating is the largest rating in the Navy, whereas in the Coast Guard, we have right now 732 health services technicians. In this budget is the provisions to increase our medical force by 400 personnel so that we can more adequately care for our own people. When you speak to the child care side of the things there, Our larger bases, it's a little bit easier than some of our more disparate areas there, but that's why we built in the inclusion of 2 new child care facilities, child development centers in Mobile, Alabama, and Elizabeth City, North Carolina. For our folks that are located in the more remote areas there, we lean heavily upon the local community there, and so there's provisions in there for making sure that we can adequately subsidize their child care.
Admiral, can you talk a little bit about this relationship between the service surpassing its recruiting goals, the timeline to reconstitute stations that were closed or downgraded, and the PC&I budget for shoreside infrastructure for buildings? Because, you know, we need to be sure that all those match. As you're bringing people back and recruiting, you have places to put them, and the places they're going are actually ready to receive them.
Yes, sir. So as you mentioned, in 2023, we began to change the force posture, reduce the force posture at many of our small boat stations throughout the United States, particularly in the Great Lakes, New England, and Mid-Atlantic, because we were 10% short in our enlisted workforce. With significant investments in recruiting and strong support from Congress, we've made significant progress. We're now at 97% of our strength, and now are poised to build on that momentum and grow the additional over 5,700 people supported by the President's budget. These small boat stations and other stations that you described, we never intended to close them, and we're not going to close them. In fact, I've directed both of our senior operational commanders in the 2 areas to come back and provide me directions on how to begin to restore those force posture at those stations. I know we've heard from our members and members of this committee certainly that they have the strongest support for the Coast Guard crews that work and live in their local communities. We could not ask for greater support from the American people. And so we have begun a process to restore that force posture. And this request in the President's budget includes 30 of that over 5,700, 3,500 of those personnel will be spread out, distributed to stations, bases, air stations, to be able to restore a workforce that has been stretched thin over the past several decades from underinvestment.
All right, we'll get some more follow-up on that. Appreciate it. And I'll yield back. Yield back to the chair.
Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes Mr. Webster for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. And Admiral Lundy and Master Chief Waldron, appreciate your testimonies. Heartfelt and to the point, not pressed, just there and stating the facts. The fact is, you're not getting paid. And after this week, the money that was sort of added in on the side is going away. So anyway, I thought about how just the things you've said state the point, and I appreciate it. Thank you for what you've done. Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for your members of your team and for all the Coast Guard members. Thank you for everything you've done. So it's my understanding, White House, from the White House, that the redirected funds for DHS will run out sometime this week, and the salaries will run out also. So what, Admiral Lundy, what, can you share what, with the committee, the impact of the not having the current funding would be on Coast Guard men and women?
Yes, sir. So there's an immediate impact that I described in the opening about not being certain about their pay. But I think the greatest feeling is that, and the Master Chief of the Coast Guard spoke to this very powerfully, they've stepped forward to serve their country. Our Coast Guard men and women serve in a dangerous and unforgiving maritime environment, often against those who would do them harm. They're frequently cold, wet, and tired, those out at the tactical edge. But they've given of themselves to step forward and do this, taken an oath. And they simply expect that in response, they're going to be supported for the sacrifice that they're giving. Because, and again, we're the only armed services, the only military service that is not within the Department of War, and so the only military service that's not being funded. My concern, sir, is that they will begin to lose heart, and they have not yet. They're still getting the mission done, but they expect that they'll be supported, rightfully so, that they're doing their part, and that we will do our part as leaders to give them the support that they need, including pay, so they can take care of their families.
Master Chief, do you have anything to add to that?
Thank you, sir. If I may, I'd like to take a moment and also focus on our civilian workforce. The week before last, I spent the week in Southeast Alaska, and while I was traveling around, I met with our civilians at Base Ketchikan. One of the gentlemen that was in the room there that I spoke with was telling me about how about a week before the executive order came out to pay all of them, he had to sell his own vehicle just to make his rent payment. And this was a man that's still showing up to work every day and working at the base that's kind of our functional equivalent to a West Coast shipyard. Without that staff of folks there, we wouldn't be repairing our ships on the West Coast right now. And he just sold his own vehicle just so that he could pay his rent and continue coming to work. Sir, that's the impact that it's having on our civilian side. On our active duty and reserve side, I'm just as concerned. With our civilians, though, they're the backbone that often gets, their value gets understated, and I would not feel right walking out of here without pointing out the impact that it's having to them as well, sir.
Yes, so, Commandant, can you explain or speak to the purpose of increased growth?
I'm sorry, the purpose of increased?
Growth.
Yes, sir. And so we've seen this historic investment, the $25 billion last year, that buys new cutters, aircraft, shore infrastructure, and technology. Now we need the people to be able to crew these assets. I mean, these assets are amazing, and the Arctic security cutters that the President announced last October that we are building and will be the first assets we deliver in 2028 to meet the President's requirement. They don't become Coast Guard cutters because we paint them with a stripe and put Coast Guard on the side. They only become cutters when we breathe life into them with the amazing Coast Guard men and women that are the best from across our nation that we train and develop into professionals, starting at Cape May and then at future training centers, places like the new training center at Birmingham Southern. That's what makes it special. So this personnel growth is significant because it enables us to crew the assets and give our people the support and services they need to be successful.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Master Chief Waldron, service members continue to be my top priority. When I talk to Coasties, I usually ask what concerns they have. A majority of the responses are somehow related to housing. And the other issue is healthcare access. How important is safe and affordable housing to service members?
Thank you, sir. As we were saying a little bit ago, how the service readiness begins with the individual readiness of the crew members and their families, I think that we can't overstate how important it is that we focus on the little things that don't relate directly to the job, because as we can remove those from their list of concerns, they can focus more squarely on doing their jobs. Housing is always at the top of that list there, sir. And depending on where in the nation our folks are serving at, that may be a combination of Coast Guard-owned housing, Coast Guard leased housing, or out on the economy. When we focus on Coast Guard-owned housing, we're growing that, and we need to continue growing that, sir. The predictability and the stability that comes with owning our own inventory of housing, it's absolutely paramount. Beyond that, whenever we look at Coast Guard lease housing, that also alleviates the concerns from those folks and allows them to more efficiently do their jobs.
Thank you. In that same vein, we know the Coast Guard has conducted housing studies in concert with the Department of Defense. However, sometimes the outcomes have had the opposite effect of lowering housing subsidies rather than raising them. How is the Coast Guard advocating for commensurate housing subsidies to guarantee that Coasties can afford to live in some of the highest cost living areas in the country?
Sir, when it comes to the housing allowance, that's one that we're tied to the Department of War on, and so I very frequently interact with the other services senior enlisted advisors, and that's a topic that we need to take a joint effort into making sure that we can address with parity.
Thank you. I'll be visiting Coasties Housing in Santa Barbara in the next week or so. If you don't know, you might want to connect with your people because I'm going to be going and visiting the areas that were greatly dilapidated over the years and that you have been doing some work on as a result of my office's inquiries. Admiral Lunde, while I'm glad that the Coast Guard is investing in housing in Santa Barbara, I'm concerned that the shoreside infrastructure account in the President's budget is wholly inadequate. Given that the shoreside infrastructure backlog is over $7 billion and growing daily, what is your plan to ensure safe, affordable housing for service members?
Sure, thank you for the question and the stressed importance on housing. We have been making investments in housing, and we've been providing, in terms of Coast Guard-owned housing, and providing the highest quality housing that our members deserve. And a great example of that is in places like Kodiak, Alaska, where last August, the Master Chief of the Coast Guard and I, along with the Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, opened that new section of housing. We need to continue to build housing in the areas where our Coast Guard people need it, especially where housing is not available on the economy. And so we look forward to continued investment, both within the President's budget request, but then in addition to that, as reflected, will be reflected on continued unfunded priorities, not only for FY26, but we look forward to delivering the unfunded priority list for FY27.
Thank you. Admiral Lunde, for the Coast Guard, readiness often depends on regular dredging. In Santa Barbara and Morro Bay, we are at risk of serious impact on Coast Guard missions if the channel is not dredged. How is the Coast Guard working with the Army Corps of Engineers to ensure mission readiness in Santa Barbara and elsewhere across the country, like the Coast Guard Yard?
Ranking Member, thank you for your advocacy and the support of this committee for the $6 million for the necessary dredging in Santa Barbara, which I understand was recently completed under the direction of the Corps of Engineers. We work closely with the Corps to address those needs, but in Santa Barbara specifically, we really needed the support there because the 87-foot patrol boat was having difficulty before the dredging getting underway. So thank you for the support to be able to get that done.
Thank you. I also wanted to draw that to your attention because, as was the case in fiscal year 26, for fiscal year 27, the President did not include funding for the Santa Barbara Harbor again. So we're going to have to continue to work together as we did in 2026 to make sure that the funding is there for the dredging so that the Coast Guard could continue performing its missions there. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes Mr. McDowell for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Admiral and Master Chief, for being with us today. And as I sit here, I've become incredibly angry because we have a job to do, and part of that job is to give you all the funding that you need. And every time that has come up for me to vote for it, I've done that because I think it's important, the job that you're doing, that we fund you. So I'm not going to spend my entire time debating why or why not that my colleagues and the Senate have not passed this appropriations bill. But I do have one question. Who in this room, just by raise of hands, who is active duty in the Coast Guard? And how many of you all are married? How many of you have children? That's who we're not paying. Their kids, their spouse, and them. That is who's not getting paid. We have to do our job. It's ridiculous to me. Admiral, last month, Admiral Allen was here, and he testified that the Coast Guard currently has 3 cyber teams to respond to attacks against our maritime transportation system, but that the Coast Guard really needed 6. How does this budget address the Coast Guard's expanding responsibilities in cyberspace?
Congressman, thank you for the question. Our cyber capabilities, these cyber protection teams, which really are part of the maneuver forces in cyberspace and operational domain, are vital to our mission success. And I was proud to command Cyber Command when we stood up the first one about a decade ago. So the President's 27 budget advances our capability in a significant way. It will fund the build out of 2 additional cyber protection teams. When complete, that will bring us to 5 active duty cyber protection teams and then a reserve cyber protection team. All that, although they focus and they do defend our network, their primary focus is on defending U.S. maritime critical infrastructure and then other critical infrastructure against threats from China, Iran, North Korea, and other malign actors that are attempting to hold our infrastructure at risk. But with the strong support of the work of the Coast Guard, in conjunction with CISA and U.S. Cyber Command, we will ensure that the U.S. Cannot be held at risk by adversaries.
In your written testimony, you discussed an incident in which 3 of our Coast Guard cutters chased away some Chinese vessels that were operating near the U.S. extended continental shelf in the Arctic. How often is the Coast Guard confronting Chinese or Russian vessels in the Arctic?
It's a common occurrence, sir. So the last year, these 5 were hovering and conducting research, and then we expect also illicit activity that threaten U.S. sovereignty just outside our 200-mile limit of the exclusive economic zone. So
Do you know what they were researching?
Sir, I would like to be able to follow up with you in a closed session so we can provide more detail at the classified level.
Okay. Does this budget adequately lend additional resources for Arctic security?
Yes, sir, it does. So first of all, it provides the $306 million for home porting of the first 2 Arctic security cutters that will be delivered by the end of 2028 to meet the President's direction, and they'll be home ported in Alaska, in the Arctic. And then it will also fund additional missionization of the commercial icebreaker Storis, which we commissioned last August and immediately went up. It was one of the 3 that chased those 5 Chinese research vessels out.
How has the Storis increased our capability to confront these Chinese and Russian vessels?
Well, sir, most immediately, before the Storis was added to the fleet, we only had 2 polar icebreakers. The Heavy, the Polar Star that went south to the South Pole for the breakout and resupply there, and then Healy, which would go north to the Arctic. So by adding Storis, we immediately doubled our Arctic polar icebreaker capability.
I think I know the answer to this, but do we have enough icebreakers in the fleet to confront every incursion on the extended continental shelf?
No, Congressman, we don't. And the President clearly recognized that when he made the announcement on the 8th of October that we were going to build out 11 Arctic security cutters to build out the fleet of icebreakers for the United States, because the Coast Guard is the only part of government that operates those icebreakers to assure the protection of our northern border and approaches and advance U.S. sovereignty and interests in the Arctic.
So for my constituents that live a significant distance away from the Arctic shelf, why should those Americans care if the Chinese and the Russians are messing around up there? What's the significance of that?
Yes, sir. Well, thank you for that, because I think it's important that every American knows that Arctic security is national security. When our sovereignty and the approaches to our border is challenged anywhere the United States exists, it is a challenge everywhere. And so we need to push back on the activities by China, Russia, and others that would seek to undermine U.S. sovereignty and challenge our border, just as we do from any other threats to our border and our U.S. sovereignty.
Thank you all. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Admiral Lundy and Mr. Walden. First of all, Admiral Lundy, thank you for the conversation we had concerning Mare Island and the Polar Star. We understand the decision you made and fully support it. But tomorrow is coming, and I'll look forward to further conversations about the Coast Guard operating at Mare Island when Mare Island is operating. So let me move to a subject that we've been working on for a long, long time, and that is the total funding of the Coast Guard and the Department of Homeland Security. You've mentioned this several times. I don't think there's a Democrat in the House of Representatives that understands what it is that the Republicans are trying to do. Not funding the operations in the Department of Homeland Security, but at the same time providing an additional $70 billion on top of the previous $70 billion for ICE and Customs and Border Patrol. Makes no sense to me. I believe it makes no sense to the general public, and you've certainly talked about it several times here, about the problem that it presents to you, to your personnel, and to your operations. So I would hope that perhaps this week the Republicans would finally get their act together and decide to fully fund the Department of Homeland Security and simultaneously provide the necessary requirements that ICE and the Customs and Border Patrol operate as a legitimate police force rather than some sort of out-of-order operation as they have in the past. Much to be done, maybe this week, since there's another deadline, that'll happen. I do want to focus on something this committee has worked on, it seems forever, and for all of us, well over a decade, and that is the construction of the new icebreakers. I want you to bring us up to date on IcePack, on the contract with Finland for 2 icebreakers, and then 3 additional icebreakers. My concern has always been that we make it in America. It was obvious from the previous failed efforts by the Coast Guard to build icebreakers that the Coast Guard and the American maritime industry was not capable. And therefore, IcePack came into existence and the 2 Finnish icebreakers that will be in the American fleet. Please bring us up to date on where this is.
Thank you, Congressman. The icebreaker programs are the top priority, and the Arctic Security Program is our highest acquisition priority because it's the President's priority. As you know, sir, the President announced 8th of October the construction of 11 Arctic security cutters and used his authority to begin that construction using the IcePact framework with Canada, the U.S., and Finland in shipyards in Finland with proven designs and proven shipbuilding know-how there, working as part of a consortium with U.S. companies so we could onshore the remaining construction. So starting with 4 overseas and then the remaining 7 built in the United States in shipyards along the U.S. Gulf Coast by American workers. So right away, we moved quickly to award 3 contracts over the following months that will enable us to begin moving forward, and that work has already begun to build out those Arctic security cutters to deliver the first ones in 2028. That will also include, under one of the consortiums, the building and the operation of a new shipyard in Texas, which we're also excited about because it expands the defense industrial base for the United States.
I'd like to go into more detail on that. Before I do, I'm sure you are aware of the SHIPS Act, which members of this committee and the Senate have been pushing along. How does this program that you've laid out fit with IcePack, fit with the program that we have on the SHIPS Act? Will you be able to utilize the SHIPS Act money to build facilities that are necessary, ports and the like?
Sir, we look forward to the support possible from the SHIPS Act to continue to advance this program, as well as our Polar Security Program, Cutter Program, the Heavy Icebreaker Program, which we funded, which is a 3-ship program, and 2 are fully funded and the 3rd is partially funded. We're making strong progress on that first Polar Security Cutter to deliver it by 2029.
You said a moment ago that there are 4 icebreakers that will be foreign-built and the remainder American-built. I understood previously there were only 2 that were going to be built in Finland.
So the previous testimony may have been when we had only awarded the first of the 3 contracts we've awarded. The President, based on his statutory authority, made a finding that in the interests of national defense, and this was announced in his announcement on the 8th of October, that we needed to begin by leveraging the overseas capability and proven shipbuilding in Finland so we could onshore more work back into the U.S. and rebuild our defense industrial base. And that's exactly what we're doing, sir.
My time has expired, but I'd like to explore with you the additional foreign-built icebreakers. And I'll, at that, yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize myself for a second round of questioning. Oh, I'm so sorry. Go right ahead, Ms. Gillen.
That's okay. Thank you, Chairman. Admiral and Master Chief, as I mentioned to you earlier, I am proud to represent the extraordinary men and women of Coast Guard Station Jones Beach in the 4th Congressional District of New York. The folks who my legislative assistant has kindly put up here for you to see are devoted to essential search and rescue and law enforcement missions across the South Shore of Long Island and a crucial part of Coast Guard sector Long Island Sound. Under Coast Guard's fiscal year 24 Force Realignment Initiative, Station Jones Beach was one of 19 stations which the Coast Guard adjusted to a new operational status, part of a broader reduction in the presence and capabilities devoted to Long Island, including the closure of the East Moriches Station and the removal of an 87-foot Coast Guard cutter from Montauk and from our region. I'm deeply concerned about the impact of those changes, and we spoke a bit about this last year, Admiral, when you appeared before this committee and you expressed your commitment to continue to prioritize the safety of Long Island boaters and that you would evaluate this situation as the Coast Guard's workforce recovers. As we discussed today, there has been the strongest recruiting year ever in more than 30 years, actually, for year 2025, and the Coast Guard has now received billions of dollars in needed investments. And I'm asking you, Admiral and Master Chief, will you consider restoring station capability at Station Jones Beach?
Thank you, Congresswoman. We certainly are looking at that. I mentioned that I had tasked our area commanders and then Atlantic area, that's Vice Admiral Joanne Burdian, to provide me recommendations on where to begin to do that restoration based on operational priorities. And so Jones Beach will be one of the stations we're looking at. The President's 27 budget request, the strength of that is that if fully funded, it will put 877 Coast Guard men and women out at those small boat stations specifically. And so we have a plan to be able to move, if supported in the 27 request, to move people out to those stations, and that'll help us restore the operating posture. And so I look forward to getting back to you as I hear from Admiral Burdian on the station priorities, including the prioritization of Jones Beach.
Well, thank you, and I hope you prioritize Long Island. How will the added investment in the Coast Guard's boat safety program lead to a reduction in boating deaths, and what else do you need from Congress to make sure we see that through?
The boating safety programs are important because the best search and rescue case is the one we prevent from happening. And so through the work of our active force and also our very strong Coast Guard auxiliary, our auxiliary volunteers, we have a very robust program working with the states to improve boating safety. Beyond that, at the commercial level, making sure that our merchant vessels, U.S. shipping, and then foreign flag vessels that operate in our ports are safe and secure is also a priority. So the 27 budget request would field an additional 227 marine inspectors and marine science technicians to be able to ensure the safety of the commercial fleet as well. And that's an important part of the 27 requests.
Thank you, Admiral. In February of last year, the GAO reported that it will cost at least $7 billion to address the Coast Guard's backlog of shoreside projects, with half of the service's facilities beyond their intended service life. I'm glad that the Coast Guard has undertaken Operation Restore Habitability as part of Force Design 2028. This long-term project will help the Coast Guard update and improve damaged or outdated infrastructure at stations and facilities across our country. We've heard specific concerns about aging infrastructure at stations like Jones Beach, and I'm glad that they were at least able to so far upgrade their front gate as part of Operation Restore Habitability. Master Chief Waldron, how is the Coast Guard prioritizing projects across the country, and what additional resources or authorities are you seeking from Congress to accelerate these improvements?
Thank you, ma'am, for bringing up Operation Restore Habitability. That's one that I personally am very proud of because we took a different approach whenever we came up with the project. What we did was recognizing that oftentimes many of our shoreside infrastructure disparities simply were because it's a very cumbersome process when we looked at the large-scale projects and the timeliness or lack thereof involved in that. What that ended up looking like was a lot of our smaller scale projects kind of started to follow the same track there. So what we did was instead, we charged our chief petty officers throughout the service with recognizing what projects can we take care of very quickly that are of a smaller scale and not just burden the crew with doing it themselves. Oftentimes in the past, we would have had the crew members at that station doing repairs to their own unit there, and to me, that came at the expense of spending time on the water doing and training what they're actually supposed to be doing. And so we sent teams around of senior enlisted leaders to recognize these projects and attack them in almost immediate nature. You mentioned Jones Beach. I agree with you. I'm ecstatic to see that they got the front gate fixed very rapidly. I was there not a month ago, and both Jones Beach and their neighboring station, Fire Island, had a very similar issue. Both have since been resolved. And it just highlighted that by having the chiefs lead the way and recognize this is what we need at our unit right now, we're able to do it much faster.
Thank you. My time is up, and I yield back.
Thank you. I got just a few more questions here. I just want to get in. Master Chief, the fiscal year 2027 budget request allows for a $2 billion increase in operations and support funding. This means that the Coast Guard can bring on additional civilian, active duty, and reserve personnel. Does the training center at Cape May have the capability to train those individuals on a timeline that this increase will demand?
Sir, I do believe that Cape May can handle it. Cape May has proven time and again that whatever the call may be, they've always arisen to the challenge there. And with Cape May being the home of our enlisted corps, and we have no reason to ever alter from that there, I also recognize that we do put a strain on them quite frequently. And having served as a company commander or a drill instructor, for lack of a better term, in Cape May there before, I acutely recognize that the goals of basic training are to develop smartly disciplined, physically fit, basically trained Coast Guard men and women. And so that's something that we can accomplish anywhere. So even while Cape May is undergoing significant reinvestment, and that will put a strain on it, I think we can absolutely figure out how to make that happen, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm kind of like to get a little information about the secondary training center in Alabama that was recently, I don't know, purchased or leased or whatever it is. Could you tell me a little bit about that place, and how long is it going to take to get it up and running for that until we can get some recruits in there to train?
Yes, sir. So the whole purpose behind Training Center Birmingham Southern was that looking across the service and all the different elements of training, we recognized that we had a shortage of available training space, and that's across both basic training up through technical training schools. And so by purchasing the new training center there, we're able to grow and meet the demand for what training we're going to actually provide. The overall vision for Birmingham Southern is that it become the enlisted leadership center of excellence. And so what that'll look like as far as which school is going to be located where between our existing training centers and what we can accomplish at Birmingham Southern, we're still sorting that out and working on it, sir. But in the end, what it does is it allows us to provide the training we need for the total workforce at speed and scale.
Do you know how long it's going to be before it's opened?
Sir, we will be hosting the courses at Training Center Birmingham Southern within calendar year 2026.
Thank you. I yield back. Mr. Carbajal?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Master Chief Waldron, another issue, as I mentioned earlier, that frequently arises when I talk to service members is mental health, and mental health access, to be exact. I'm concerned that the service is not currently equipped to appropriately address this challenge. I appreciate the Coast Guard's effort to provide more embedded mental health professionals, but what is the service's ultimate goal to ensuring universal access to mental health care?
Sir, I share that same concern when it comes to mental health care, and we've taken several different approaches to furthering where we stand with that. For one, included in the budget request this year is the inclusion of the numerous more mental health providers into the budget. But additionally, from the vantage point of getting where we need to be, the Commandant has required all flag officers and senior officers to attend the 2-day Applied Suicide Intervention Skills training. And then from the Chief Petty Officer side, that's also a requirement in my Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard standing orders that all Chief Petty Officers going through initiation will attend either ASSIST or the Suicide Awareness for Everyone 4-hour training. Mental health is something that is also very, very frequently tied to physical readiness, and I don't think that the two can be separated. That's one of the main reasons why we are also so heavily investing into what we know as the Physical Readiness Program, is because physical readiness includes mental readiness.
Thank you. As you can see from my questions today and in previous hearings, it's one thing to have state-of-the-art equipment, ships, and all the lethal weapons we need, but it's important to also make sure that our coasties are taken care of. At the end of the day, that's what makes the Coast Guard, is the people. And if our coasties and their families don't have the support, the resources they need to have a high quality of life, it's gonna impact our readiness. So you're gonna always see me continue to advocate for a balance of our resources for our equipment, our ships, and our lethality of weapons, but balance that with making sure that our service members, every day, they and their families are being taken care of. And I sure hope that's top of mind every day when you look at all the missions that we need to plan for. With that, Mr. Chair, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Garamendi, do you have a question?
I do, sir.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Admiral Linda, you surprised me when you said that there are going to be 4 foreign-built icebreakers. I was previously under the, assumption that there'd be only 2. Could you describe the other 2 and where the authority came for the construction of those additional 2 foreign-built icebreakers?
Yes, sir. We're executing the President's direction announced on the 8th of October. And so what that entails in terms of building out the 11 is the award to 2 consortiums, contracts to 2 consortiums. Each will begin to build the icebreakers in shipyards in Finland. The first is in Rauma shipyard, the second in Helsinki, with each of those consortiums building 2 over in Finland, a total of 4. The remaining 7, those consortiums will build in the United States. The first contract to already begin building those 7 in the United States has already been awarded. That was the one of the 3 that we awarded to Bollinger, which is part of the one of consortiums. So that's always been the plan, sir.
No, I don't believe it's always been the plan. It's always been the plan to build America. And because of the failure of the Coast Guard to be able to produce, we then moved with ICE-PAC to bring the Finns in with their expertise and knowledge, but to my knowledge, it was only 2. I'm curious as to where the authority for the additional 2 has come from. If it's only from the President, I'm not sure that's satisfactory authority. I would like the committee to look into that. My earlier question raised the SHIPS Act, which is specifically designed to rebuild the American maritime industry, and specifically the ability to build ships in America and to rebuild our ports. It seems to me the Coast Guard is going exactly the wrong direction here by outsourcing the construction of additional icebreakers. I'm curious about the authority. I'd appreciate it if you would deliver to me and perhaps to the committee the specific authority that you believe you have to build additional foreign icebreakers. The Buy American, Build American law remains in place. There was a waiver in that process. So if you'd like to comment now, please do. Otherwise, deliver specific information as to where the authority came from for the additional foreign-built icebreakers.
So the Coast Guard has no independent authority to build U.S. Coast Guard cutters overseas. We are executing the President's direction under the President's authority and finding. And so that is how we're proceeding, sir.
Therein lies a major challenge for our democracy. The President seems to operate as though he were the king and does whatever he wants to do, including waiving or ignoring American law, that is, make it in America. This needs to be fully understood here. To contract and build and to find the appropriations for these additional foreign-built icebreakers seems to be contrary to the law and contrary to the underlying SHIPS Act, and in fact, the President's maritime the President's Maritime Action Program that he put forward. With that, Mr. Chairman, I think we need to explore this fully and determine where the authority lies, where the appropriation lies for the construction of foreign-built icebreakers beyond the two, which I believe have been authorized. With that, I yield back.
Sir, if I may just, yes, sir, the President has statutory authority, and he's used that authority under the law, and we are following the President's direction to implement it. I look forward to briefing you in detail on that, sir.
If you would, please do so, and we will explore the actual laws and the President's authority. So, once again, a major policy issue here, major constitutional issue as to who has the authority here. With that, we've got another challenge. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Thank you. You've done a great job today, and I really appreciate it. I just want to put to bed one rumor that we keep hearing floating around, that the Chinese are putting an engine in one of the Finnish ships. Can we put that rumor to bed today?
Yes, sir, I've not heard that rumor, and I'm not aware of that. I will make sure that is not the case, but I haven't heard that rumor, sir. Thank you for surfacing that so I could knock it down.
A lot of rumors go around here. You've done a great job today. I'm very much appreciative of you being here. And I know I have full confidence in what you're doing and where we're going with the Coast Guard. Does anybody else have anything else? Seeing none, this committee stands and adjourned.